should go fine. I'd like to introduce Bob Stern and Taras Gerya. Bob Stern is originally from California, did undergraduate and PhD at University of California. So that's a good connection. And when he did postdoc at Carnegie, I also sort of went there, but much later. After it, he got position at University of Texas, Dallas, where he stayed until now. And when I came to US, I knew sort of first thing that I knew about Bob was about his work on Neoproterozoic on Arabian Shield and northeastern Africa, and I wasn't really aware that there is other side of him working on modern convergent margin and subduction zone. With our new faculty members at UCR, I kind of learn about it. And Taras Gerya, originally from Russia, did his undergraduate in Tomsk State University, and when moved to Moscow, worked in top-notch experimental lab in Moscow called Chernogolovka. I think he started originally working on thermodynamics, and over time evolved to mantle and crustal dynamics, and I did Humboldt Fellowship in Germany, and for last over 10 years stayed as a professor at ETH. So with this, I pass to Bob, and I guess Taras will help when questions comes. Bob, you might
still muted.
Mute yourself.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you today about a topic that Taras and I are both very interested in, we find very exciting, and we are confident that it will be quite controversial. So let's dig into it. So the title tells you the story we're going to tell, which is there was a single lid episode in Mesoproterozoic time, and this was disrupted, and basically the Neoproterozoic story is creating the global plate tectonic mosaic we see today. Let's see if we can navigate. There we go. So here's an outline of the talk. I have a little introduction to the controversy, planetary perspectives, a little bit about single lid tectonics, a little bit about how to start plate tectonics, a little bit about evidence that plate tectonics began in the last billion years. Going to have a lot less than 21 slides on single lid, the Mesoproterozoic. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the recent start to plate tectonics helps explain, and then we'll wrap it up and get to questions. So when did plate tectonics start? There's a wide range of opinions. This tells you something that the majority of the geologic community doesn't accept a recent onset to plate tectonics. But things are changing as we start exploring the record and all of its implications. So, oh, I think I got the wrong PowerPoint here. I modified this, and sorry about that confusion. Let me go to the right one. Yeah, because this is the 45 slide talk. Sorry about that. We've seen that, we've seen that, we've seen that. Okay, we want to understand the evolution of plate tectonics and the tectonic history of the Earth and other active silicate bodies. It's a complex problem. This complicates arriving at a solution, but when we have answers to all the questions, there should be some alignment that will provide some confidence that we've got useful answers. And in this effort, we should keep an open mind and consider all possible scenarios and lie and lines of evidence. We want to understand Earth's tectonic evolution for its own sake, but we also want to use this to understand the evolution of other Earth systems and life. So there's two different perspectives on uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past that we can bring in. So basically the first one is Earth-centric. Whatever tectonic style Earth has today, it has always had. So the simplest conclusion of that is plate tectonics, always and forever. The second one is that all active silicate bodies have the same tectonic style. 3 of the 4 have single lid tectonics. So we've got this conflict between what's going on Earth today and what's going on the other active silicate bodies. So Earth uniformitarianism and planetary uniformitarianism do not agree. So I want to take 2.5 minutes and show you a video. So I'll escape this, come into this, and hopefully you can hear it.
The concept of emergent phenomenon explains that any high-energy, far from equilibrium system will organize itself in ways that cannot be predicted from knowing its individual components. In a nutshell, an emergent system will organize itself so that energy flows in the system will be less chaotic. Emergence is not a theory. It is a way of looking at many different kinds of energetic systems. Emergence is closely related to self-organization, complexity, and evolution. Many things exhibit emergent behavior. Animals, ecosystems, oceanic currents, hurricanes and spiral galaxies, hydrothermal systems, and civilizations are just a few examples. In emergent systems, low-level rules for constituent parts give rise to higher-level system complexity. Entirely new properties and behaviors emerge, without direction and with characteristics that cannot be predicted from knowledge of the constituents alone. In the January issue of GSA Today, Bob Stern of UT Dallas and Taras Gerya of ETH Zurich discuss how thinking about emergence can help us gain new perspectives about Earth history. In this short groundwork article, they discuss how thinking about emergence can help us understand Earth and other silicate planets and moons and how their tectonics evolved. Convecting silicate planets are high-energy, far from equilibrium systems, and as their interiors cool, their lithospheres respond by becoming thicker, denser, and stronger. On Earth, these tectonic styles are likely to have merged into the plate tectonic system we see today. Want to learn more? Check out Earth Evolution, Emergence, and Uniformitarianism in the link provided below.
Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so this is one of many videos we've made. We think one of the things we do at UT Dallas is make videos about the Earth. So if you have time and interest, please go to our YouTube channel, UT Dallas or UTD Geoscience Studio, and please subscribe up here. All right, let's get back to single lid. So 3 out of 4 of the big active silicate bodies in our solar system have single lid tectonics, and all 3 of these are different. Now, Europa might be a 4th, but we just don't know what's going on underneath its icy lid. Io has got kind of a heat pipe thing where lavas are coming out all the time, getting buried, melting again, and coming up. That's a very active kind of single lid tectonics. Venus has many plumes and drips. You can see that in the corona and all of this. It's Earth twin, but it doesn't have plate tectonics. And Mars is, you know, an active silicate planet on intensive care. It's got very few good plumes and 1 good rift. These are all single lid silicate bodies, and they tell us the wide range of single lid behaviors that we have to figure out. So what was Earth's tectonic style before the present episode of plate tectonics? Well, it must have been some variety of single lid. I mean, that's basically the only other thing it could be. And this is fundamentally different than fractured lid or plate tectonics. And it gets confusing very quickly because there are many names and ideas for single lid tectonic and magmatic behavior. People call it stagnant lid, sluggish lid, plutonic squishy, heat pipe, also plume lid tectonics. We haven't even settled on names yet. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to understand the range of single lid behaviors and explaining these results to geologists and geochemists. So very simply, single lid tectonics can be just as vigorous in terms of magmatism and deformation as plate tectonics. Some people make the mistake of thinking that all deformation and magmatism has to be related to plate tectonics, but that's not true. Drips and delaminations accompanying single lid tectonic episodes will deliver surface materials to the deep mantle, explaining many isotopic results and trace element results. And so when you see something that says, well, they found some anomaly in this isotope or this trace element ratio, that means plate tectonics started then. Take that with a grain of salt. All right, now a lot of this work is being done by the Taurus group, and which he co-leads with Paul Tackley in geophysical fluid dynamics at ETH Zurich. So I encourage you to learn more about this remarkable numerical modeling group and how they can help us understand the Earth. So we pretty much all agree that Earth's mantle has cooled. This is a figure modified after Hawksworth that summarizes, at least Taurus and I agree on something like from about 2 billion years to present. You know, we're still discussing what happened over here. But we know that there's strong evidence for true subduction and plate tectonics in the last several 100 million years. We've got this thing that's well known as the boring billion that Kent Condy talked about a couple weeks ago. And then something like protoplate tectonics happened about 2.0 to 1.8 billion years ago. But through all this time, the Earth's mantle potential temperature over here has been decreasing. You know, we can discuss at what rate, but 100 to 200 degrees per billion years doesn't seem outlandish. So with that cooling, the lithosphere and the asthenosphere have been changing in ways that are perhaps very amenable to thinking about from an emergent point of view. So with numerical modeling that Taurus and his group have done, we see that today we have modern plate tectonics where we have a strong lid, a strong lithosphere, but not so strong it can't break and start a new subduction zone, and all sorts of the processes that we're quite familiar with over the last few 100 million years happen. But before that, with the hotter mantle, things might have dripped off into something that looked like a subduction zone, but it didn't have the strength to keep it together, or it didn't have the density to pull the overlying plate, or a combination of both. This understanding of what drives the plates, which is the sinking of lithosphere and subduction zones, coupled with an understanding of Earth's thermal history, leads us to think, maybe plate tectonics is something that happened relatively recently. All right, let's look at an animation of single lid tectonics that Sizova et al. in Taurus's group generated with some very simple two-dimensional modeling. Simple, I say. I couldn't do it. So that's a thermal structure, and every once in a while something collapses at the base of the lithosphere, and that creates openings for material to rise up. It's very active, very episodic, very unpredictable. We probably don't need to see the whole thing, but I think you get a sense that these single lid regimes under certain conditions can be every bit as active as plate tectonics at the same time that they're different. Oops. All right, so if we think just generally that within the context of the cooling mantle and what that means for the lithosphere, we expect the lithosphere is going to thicken and strengthen with time. And as melt generation in the oceanic crust decreases with time because of the cooling mantle, that the crust will become a smaller and smaller proportion of that oceanic lithosphere, so that it will become denser with time. And everybody agrees there's an early magma ocean, or pretty much everybody. And that's got a crust over, and then probably we went to something like heat pipe. And then the mantle lithosphere started to form, and we would get, some kind of drips and extension and shallow plumes. And then with time, as the lithosphere thickened, those drips and delaminations would have become larger scale. And then at some point, perhaps, we end up with plate tectonics, so that we go from young and hot to mature and cool through this episode of different kinds of stagnant lid, for which we can't really describe them well, except to say that from more active to less active. So early hot, late cool, lithospheric weakness, none to 100 and 200 kilometers thick, as we see today. So the next question is, when did the force balance needed to sustain plate tectonics first exist? So we can't, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to start plate tectonics. So we have to consider that the oceanic lithosphere had to be denser than the underlying asthenosphere in order for plate tectonics to be possible. Until that time, you're going to have some kind of active stagnant lid. The oceanic lithosphere had to be strong enough to hold together during subduction, not break off, as we saw in one of those earlier numerical models. And finally, there had to be a way to generate long, localized lithospheric weak zones where new subduction zones could form. So, for example, the Izu-Bohn and Mariana subduction initiation about 50 million years ago happened along a now deformed transform zone, transform fault fracture zone, which is a fundamental lithospheric weakness. So those three things are needed for plate tectonics. They're not sufficient, but they're necessary. So one of the reasons that we need a long lithospheric weakness is because the plate has to bend. And so this is some work Xin Xiao in Taras's group did. Let's take a look. So you can see it flexing here. It has to flex, and then that flexing propagates along strike. It can't happen in a narrow place because the plate is too strong. It needs room for that flexing to occur. Let's look at it in a series of cross sections where we have older lithosphere on this side, thicker, younger, more buoyant on this side, and they're separated by a weakness in here. So you can see it start here in the middle and then propagate to either side. And that's the propagation of subduction that has to occur in order for a subduction zone to begin. That's in geology a couple years ago. So how do we start the first subduction zone? Well, talked a little bit about lithospheric weaknesses caused by plate tectonics. That's transforms and fracture zones, but those didn't exist before plate tectonics. And we need a long 1,000-kilometer or more lithospheric weakness, easy to make with plate tectonics, but these didn't exist until plate tectonics began. So how do we do that? There's three main ideas. One of them is large bolide impact, which has been developed. But this is only likely to happen early in Earth history. So yeah, if plate tectonics started early, that could have been responsible, but not as late as we're arguing for, at least the most recent episode. It could be inherited lithospheric damage, which Bercovici and Ricard explored a few years ago. And we find very attractive the idea that large hot mantle plumes were responsible for rupturing the lithosphere, as we see for the Caribbean in the Cretaceous. So this is an animation by Jessica Munch in Taurus's group. So we're going to look at what happens when a plume hits the base of the lithosphere, and here we're looking down on it and looking at elevation. So you can see there's a plateau formation, and then you can generate a detachment that can evolve into a subduction zone. You know, this has to be huge, but it's possible. All right, we can look at it again here. Let's see where that, there we go. So that red is the melting region. And here we see lithospheric collapse around the margin, and you know, one of them drips off, the other one turns into a true subduction zone, and away we go. Now that's how we can generate the first subduction zone. But that's not plate tectonics. You know, one swallow does not make a spring, and neither does a single subduction zone. We have to infect the entire globe with plate tectonic features, subduction zones, transform faults, ridge, mid-ocean ridge spreading centers. And so there's a question of how long would this take once the first self-sustaining subduction zone was established. And back of envelope calculation, okay, today the global network is on the order of 50,000 kilometers. Okay, the infection rate would be the propagation rate, and we can say, okay, this is likely to occur at something like a plate tectonic rate. Plate tectonic rates are on the order of 100 millimeters per year. That's equivalent to 100 kilometers per million years. So a single lid plate tectonic regime could be converted to a plate tectonic regime at 100 kilometers of new plate boundary per million years. 50,000 divided by 100 is equal to 500 million years. So obviously, that's oversimplified, but it gives us an order of magnitude way to think about it. The transition from single lid to plate tectonics didn't happen overnight. It could have taken as long as a geologic era. So, is there any evidence that the length of plate boundaries has been increasing with time? So this is a study by out of Sinti Lee's group at Rice. And basically, they looked at the lengths of continental arcs. So those are convergent margins, such as we see here. They didn't consider intraoceanic arcs, but that's okay. Let's figure that this is some reasonable proportion of all convergent margins. And this is what they found. So 750 million years ago to the present, we know there's a lot of intraoceanic convergent margins today. You can take a look at what they did and decide for yourself whether or not that supports the idea that the length of convergent boundaries has been increasing with time over the last 750 million years. I think it did. It does. All right. So let's very briefly look at evidence that plate tectonics began in Neoproterozoic time. And we'll look at just 3 plate tectonic indicators. These are rocks and minerals that only form by plate tectonic processes today. These are not isotopes. These are not trace element ratios. This is geological evidence, not geochemical microscopic stuff. So the first one is evidence for seafloor spreading and subduction initiation. These are ophiolites. The second are indications of subduction from metamorphic rocks. And the last is evidence for continental collision. These are things like, ultra high pressure metamorphic terrains. So if we look at these, ophiolites is the seafloor spreading and subduction initiation indicator. There's a couple of ophiolites back here at this time of proto-plate tectonics that we talked about. With that exception, all of them are Neoproterozoic and younger. Blue schists, all of them are Neoproterozoic and younger. Lawsonite-bearing metamorphic rocks. Lawsonite is a very interesting metamorphic mineral that is unique to modern subduction zones. Almost all of them are Phanerozoic. And jadeite is a kind of jade, which is a kind of a gemstone. So a different community is interested in this than the academic community. And that is also Phanerozoic. Then if we look at the collision indicators, we can look at ultra high pressure metamorphic rocks. These are fragments of continental crust that's been subjected to 100, 150 kilometers and brought back to the surface. The oldest one is about 700 million years old, 600 million years old. Ruby and sapphire, these are of interest to the gem collecting people. Again, there's one occurrence here at 2100 and maybe one back here in the Archean, but overwhelmingly Phanerozoic. And all right, now you don't want to believe me, so we'll go to somebody more reliable, Michael Brown and his group, and he's looked at the apparent peak metamorphic temperatures and pressures, T over P, so that gives a thermal gradient in degrees per gigapascals. And what he sees, what they see is that you've had hot metamorphism for a long time and high pressure metamorphism for a long time, but this interesting high pressure, low temperature metamorphism that we uniquely associate with subduction is something that's only happened in the last billion years or so. Again, with this exception of things around 1.8 to 2 billion years. This is consistent with the evidence from blue schists, lawsonites, and those things. And then another look at it from Palin et al. Shows the same sorts of things in a different way. These things that we associate with plate tectonics start showing up in the last, seriously in the last 700 million years. Although, again, we see this interesting evidence for something like plate tectonics happening about 2 billion years ago. So, if plate tectonics began in Neoproterozoic time, and the geologic evidence is very clear on that point, then Earth's tectonic regime in Mesoproterozoic time must have been some kind of single lid. Was it? Well, if Mesoproterozoic igneous and tectonic activity was not caused by plate tectonics, it must look different in many ways. Does it? And I think Kent Conde, who talked 2 weeks ago, would agree. Yes, it does. So just to remind some of you when the Mesoproterozoic was, is about 1 billion years ago to 1600 million years ago. It's 13% of Earth history, just before the Neoproterozoic. So 2 weeks ago, Kent Conde offered a plate tectonic interpretation for the Mesoproterozoic. And I was really interested in this because Kent and I, I studied the Mesoproterozoic like for a year or so with Kent guiding me. And we gave a joint paper on this at GSA Phoenix. So using the same data sets, and these are mostly his compilations, but not all, we came to very different conclusions. So here is the way that the Mesoproterozoic tectonic and igneous activity differed from that of Neoproterozoic and younger times. There's less juvenile crust, there's less orogenic activity, there's less zircon production. There are some unusually enriched igneous rocks, including an unusual abundance of A-type granite. There are these very strange things called massif anorthosites. There's very little calc-alkaline igneous activity, which is characteristic of arcs. There's very few greenstones built. From an economic point of view, there's very little gold mineralization, if any. And interestingly enough, the work of Brown's group indicates that the thermal regimes were high, but very few metamorphic belts formed. And in addition to these unusual positive things about the Mesoproterozoic, it lacks the positive evidence for plate tectonics that we were just discussing. No ophiolites, no metamorphic rocks or minerals, indicating indicating subduction and continental collision. So you can read about that in the December issue of GSA Today, free to download. And this was Kent Condy's conclusions 2 weeks ago, that A-type granites are characteristic of convergent margins, and they are abundant through time, that massif anorthosites, we would find lots of them if we got down deep enough, that there were lots of passive continental margins, and basically that there is no convincing evidence to support a return to stagnant lid tectonic regime on Earth during the Mesoproterozoic. So we respectfully disagree with these conclusions, especially the last one. So let's talk about the evidence for Mesoproterozoic single lid and both positive and negative. First of all, let's look at the positive evidence. So there were no subduction zones to pump water into the mantle. I mean, certainly some water got in because delamination will carry that, but the magmas are overwhelmingly dry, including these A-type and these massif type anorthosites. There were no mid-ocean ridges to release mantle heat, so the lithosphere naturally would heat up, and that explains the elevated T over P that Brown's group found. There was no Wilson cycle to make new ocean basins, so there are no passive margins. And the usual ore deposits disappear and new ones appear. That's the positive evidence. The negative evidence is that if plate tectonics, we just don't see the evidence for plate tectonics that we just went over. So it must have been some kind of single lid. So here are some single lid indicators. Dry magma indicator 1, A-type granites, dry magma indicator 2, anorthosites, the insulation indicator, Brown's thermobarometric ratio, and the evidence for lack of continental rift and drift by the lack of passive margins from Bradley. So he's got these as more confident and less confident, and you can see what the Mesoproterozoic looks like. This is Ashwell's compilation of A-type granites. No, that's Condy's. And this is Ashwell's compilation of anorthosites. Okay, so none of this data was compiled by Taras or me. It's all from the literature. All right, so let's look at the ore deposits. Here are some Mesoproterozoic single lid magmatic ore deposits from Goldfarb. And here are some important magmatic ore deposits not found in the Mesoproterozoic: orogenic gold, porphyry, copper. So, you know, most of us don't know much about these kinds of ore deposits because they're kind of restricted to the Mesoproterozoic. But any economic geologist could immediately see something different about the Mesoproterozoic. All right, so the unusual nature of Mesoproterozoic igneous and tectonic activity can be best explained by a single lid tectonic style. We've already gone over this. This is a controversy. And we've already gone over this. There's the lack of these plate tectonic indicators in the Mesoproterozoic. And, you know, this is a really good time to explain the boring billion. And I think, and just a word in defense of the boring billion, it really wasn't boring at all. It was just different. And we should appreciate how it was different and what that meant for the evolution of other Earth systems. All right, so how Mesoproterozoic single lid tectonic regime evolved into plate tectonics is a very exciting and potentially rewarding field of 21st century research. So here we have something like a cartoon for the early to mid Mesoproterozoic, you know, with A-type granites and anorthosites and delamination and the lithosphere thinning due to heat buildup over time. The Grenville, the late Mesoproterozoic, was a time of deformation and related mid-continent extension. This must be an important part of this story in the evolution from single lid to plate tectonics. But, you know, now we're in this regime, and that regime is a global mosaic. So the last third of Earth history in a nutshell, from 1600 to a billion years ago, we had a single lid tectonic regime. From a billion to 600 million years ago, we had the beginning of the multi-plate system and the growth of the global plate mosaic. And from 600 million years until present or so, the modern plate tectonic regime. Does this synopsis help us better understand the evolution of other Earth systems and life? And as a final caveat, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So is this model useful? So we know that the Mesoproterozoic was a time of climatic stasis, and the Neoproterozoic was a time when all systems were being disrupted. We have the Snowball Earth glaciations in here, and then we return to normal, something like stasis in the Phanerozoic. But the Mesoproterozoic episode of climate stability, as expected for a single lid tectonic style, was followed by a remarkable time of climate instability, the Neoproterozoic Snowball Earth. And that transition from single lid to plate tectonics must have disrupted all Earth systems. So let's just think of a couple of these. The Neoproterozoic climate crisis, also known as Snowball Earth, and the acceleration of biological evolution in Neoproterozoic time. And this simple model of Mesoproterozoic evolving to Phanerozoic plate tectonics helps us understand these perhaps. So let's talk about these climate crises. And there, Nate Miller and I, a couple years ago, summarized the 22 causes of Neoproterozoic Snowball Earth, and thought, okay, which of these could be explained by a Neoproterozoic transition to plate tectonics? And of the 22, 5 of them are extraterrestrial. They're not going to be explained by anything happening on Earth. But of the others, 17 of them are consistent with something like a transition to plate tectonics. The big question is, how did Earth's tectonic evolution affect biological evolution? So here we see, it's widely known that evolution really took off in the Neoproterozoic, and that transition could have been responsible, but how? So it could have affected biological evolution in 5 different ways. So it could have increased the nutrient supply because of more relief and weathering as a result of increased arc volcanism and collision. It could have helped increase the oxygenation of atmosphere and ocean due to enhanced photosynthetic activity related to the first. There would have been perhaps climate amelioration due to CO2 drawdown. The increased habitat formation and destruction due to the Wilson cycle. And finally, a slow but sustained pressure from environmental changes due to tectonics associated with the Wilson cycle. So now we're getting into a realm of another thing that Taras and I are working on about biogeodynamics, how Earth's tectonic evolution is reflected in its biosphere. And you can look at a video of that on the GSS channel. And basically, this increased acceleration of evolution in the Neoproterozoic, especially in the Ediacaran, could be related to the fact that you're breaking up and continents and creating new habitats in different environments. This is just habitat formation. It's not considering the other 4 things, but you can see how there'd be more diverse habitats forming more frequently in a plate tectonic regime than in a single lid regime. So in summary, how to advance our understanding of the evolution of plate tectonics and its effect on Earth systems? Well, first, build on recent advances in solar system exploration, indicating that single lid dominates lithospheric behavior of large active silicate bodies. Don't be blinded by Earth's present episode of plate tectonics. Second, build and test increasingly realistic numerical geodynamic models for the convective style of active silicate bodies. We need those models to understand what's possible, what's not possible. Third, embrace thinking about emergent systems to acknowledge that Earth has likely experienced multiple tectonic styles through its history. Don't be blinded to the fact that Earth is a far from equilibrium, high energy system and is almost certain to exhibit emergent behavior. Fourth, test geologic evidence that suggests a single lid tectonic regime in Mesoproterozoic time was transformed during this prolonged transition to plate tectonics by the end of the Neoproterozoic. The geologic record has to trump all other considerations. Anything that is possible must be able to happen. Oh no, that's the wrong way to phrase it. Anything that happens must be possible. That's what I was saying. And finally, expect that any transition from single lid to plate tectonics will disrupt all Earth systems. Look for evidence of this disruption and develop models to explain this. And that is the end of my talk, our talk. So thank you very much for listening, and I suspect you might have some questions.
Yeah, great talk, Bob. Yeah, you definitely have generated a fair amount of noise in the chat box here. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to read off some of the things people have said, and if I'm reading your comment and you would like to chat with Bob directly, please just unmute yourself, and by the time I'm done reading, you guys have the stage. So first, Damien Nance asks, if plate tectonics did not start until the Neoproterozoic, what type of tectonics produced blue schist and eclogites, etc., at 1.8 to 2.0?
Yes, Damien, that it's pretty clear something happened about 1.8 to 2.0. Taras and I have got our hands full with the last third of Earth history, so we haven't really spent much time thinking about it. But that in these diagrams that I showed, let me pull it back up, and I'll reshare. Let's see, where is that? Reshare. I should be able to share again, shouldn't I? Yeah, okay. Share. So this is Hawksworth et al.'s diagram modified to show something like proto-plate tectonics in here. So that is acknowledged. That evidence is intriguing, and I don't think there's a problem.
Yeah, I can probably add a little bit concerning relationship in between subduction and plate tectonics. So single lid can associate with local subduction. So and we can see locally subduction signature. What is most important is that there was no interconnected network of plate mosaic as we have it now. So and this is the major difference in between subduction present single lid system and modern plate tectonic like system. So we should not confuse these two things.
Yeah, I think my concern then is you can't use subduction as an indicator of plate tectonics if single lid tectonics can produce the same features.
Point taken. Alex?
I can comment a little bit. So potentially you do see differences in between, subduction indicators for short plate tectonics episode or local subduction in case of single lid regime and modern plate tectonics. Some of the indicators, they simply do not show up. And so I think, this is a useful distinction in between, looking at all indicators for modern style subduction and plate tectonics. So unfortunately, due to some limitations in understanding, we don't know how this transition from modern style plate or to modern style plate tectonic should look like. But definitely these, past old episodes of plate tectonic like behavior, they geologically, they do not look like modern style subduction. For example, during these past episodes of activity, cratonic kilns were built which are not forming now, and lots of other things happened that do not appear in the modern style tectonic. So I do think that it's possible to outline differences in between, subduction plus single lid and real plate tectonics.
All right, thanks for that. Next we have, I think Nick Roberts wanted to discuss your slide with, it was maybe 5 slides from the end with points for your argument, argued that they said point 1 is wrong, points 2 and 3 are pure conjecture.
Let's see, are we looking at, let me reshare. Reshare.
It may even be useful to keep your slides up.
Okay, is it this slide? Nick, is it this slide?
Hi, Bob. Can you hear me?
Yes, is it this slide?
No, it's much earlier on. Point 2 was about mid-ocean ridges. Point 3 was something else. Point 1 was no. Yes, that one.
Okay. So no subduction zones to pump water into the mantle, so magmas are dry. A-type, and this is shown by the abundance of A-type granites and massive type anorthosites. I'm using compilations of
Okay, well, but point 1
and Ashwall. These are not our compilations. So
no, but I'm interested in evidence for mid-ocean ridges, because if neither of us can present evidence for mid-ocean ridges, can we use that for or against plate tectonics back in the Proterozoic? Point 1, well, all of the A-types intrude into I-type crust. There's lots of I-types.
True.
Point 3, no Wilson cycle. I still argue that's stuff conjecture, but anyway. The point
Kent did also. Kent did also, but this is Bradley's compilation.
Picking the A types is fine, but that misses the fact that I types are still more abundant, probably.
Okay.
But that's something we can work on anyway.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Francis McDonald had an issue with what you had to say about the Grenville, I think. Before you showed the slide on the Grenville, he said, "What about Grenville?" But then you addressed it. So maybe, and then then his next question was no subduction at Grenville. So I think he wants you to discuss what you had shown that your slide 38. You didn't show subduction at Grenville.
No, so these are the subduction, the plate tectonic indicators, and we're interested to see these updated all the time. I think that the ophiolites come from Dillick's compilation.
So I just want to clarify with you, you are making the argument that there are no arcs, no subduction, or no plate movement associated with the Grenville origin, just for clarity. That's what you're arguing?
No, I didn't say anything about plate movement. Let's just look at the plate tectonic indicators, and that the paleomagnetic record is not being used in this argument. I think that would need to be included and discussed. There wasn't really time to do that in 45 minutes. That would be a talk in its own right, wouldn't it?
And is all the magmatism, A-type magmatism is what you're arguing for the Grenville?
No, didn't say that. I said there's an unusual abundance of, oops, that's the ore deposits. an unusual abundance of A-types and anorthosites, did not look at the I-types. Kent Condi's compilation, and if he's in the audience, he can comment, argues that there's a relatively little calc-alkaline activity, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, I would just say there's very well documented arcs and collisional arcs, and very well documented collisions at that time. So I'm a little bit confused of how the Grenville origin fits into your model of no plate tectonic indicators. And generally just the sort of extreme view that we have to have a single stagnant lid. I mean, I really appreciate your arguments that feed off the modeling of Terra about the increasing strength and coupling of the crust through time. And I would just suggest or throw out there is that maybe a lot of these indicators could be explained through more shallow slab breakoff rather than a full stagnant lid regime.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So we should not confuse single lid with stagnant lid. So these are really different things. Single lid may be very active regime. You can have collisions, you can have locally subduction, you can have drips, strong crustal deformation. So this paper by Sizova with Mike Brown and myself and Kurt Stuwe, it was showing that this is pretty active regime, including horizontal tectonics. So you can have collisions. It just it does not look like modern style plate tectonics. So it's simply a different regime.
And are plate speeds the same?
Yeah, plate speed can be the same. The only thing that was different, the spreading was rather predominantly ultra slow. And then subduction was not related to spreading at all, because spreading was compensated by lithospheric drips rather than subduction. And subduction was episodic sometimes, not in all models. So this is quite counterintuitive regime. When we first time seen it in numerical experiments, we had no intuition to interpret it. But it's very active, so it's not stagnant. It's definitely tectonomagmatic, very active regimes, and at some stages, plate deformation rates are comparable to plate tectonics.
Thank you, Tara.
Okay, Kent, it looks like you're poised to step in. And since you were referenced in this talk so much, I mean, I think it's only right that you're able to step in and talk whenever you see a point to discuss as well. So if you would like to unmute yourself and touch on any points, Kent, go ahead.
Well, there are obviously many points. And one thing I noticed that Bob did not bring up was the paleomag data at all. Clearly, you cannot discuss this question without bringing up the paleomag data. The paleomag data is very convincing that we had large horizontal movements of plates. Now, the configuration of these plates indeed is still controversial, but there's no controversy as far as I've been able to understand that we had large horizontal movements during this time. That's number one. When you put origins together, as we have done, you do get long origins like the Great Proterozoic origin. And this indicates to me that we've had large interlinkage of plates that occurred during this period of time. Also, when you took my A-type granite data and the massive anorthosite data, you didn't take my updated graphs that I showed in my talk. You took my outmoded ones, which were not up to date, which you can't do. The same way with passive margins, you've got to use the passive margins that we understand today. There are a lot of passive margins during the boring billion. It's what you have not done, I think, Bob, that has led you down the wrong track. One other thing, all of your indicators of plate tectonics can also be explained by a cooling lithosphere with time and a strengthening lithosphere. When you pass a certain strength threshold, which I've suggested in a paper that's in press, you can pick up all of these indicators you're talking about, but you still had plate tectonics going on before this time.
All right. Looks like point taken, Bob. Am I correct?
I'm sorry, say again?
Would you, I guess point was taken and you don't want to respond?
Well, I think Taras and I have made our arguments clear. It's hard to imagine that those A-type curves and that Bradley did a bad job of compiling passive margins, but I'm happy to look at new compilations as they're published.
And I would like to add that potentially movements of continents does not necessarily imply global modern style plate tectonics, because movements of continental-like feature was even proposed for Venus, where there is no plate tectonics. But there people are suggesting that mantle flows are driving continental-like areas, and they see jamming of kind of lithosphere and crust in front of moving terrains, and then strike-slip structure at the sides of terrains. And this is still very active single lead style with lots of horizontal deformation and lots of potentially movement, but without global plate tectonics. So once again, you know, important point is not to confuse horizontal movements and subduction with modern style plate tectonics, because to me, modern style plate tectonics are rigid plates, subduction correlated with spreading. So on one side subduction, on the other side it's compensated by spreading. And this correlation that is obvious to us, it completely breaks with increasing temperature of the mantle. For example, due to magmatism, you can have subduction without any spreading on the other side, or you can have spreading, ultra slow spreading that is not compensated by subduction, but it can be compensated by other processes that, you know, recycle lithosphere, such as drips and delamination. So, and if we call anything in which we have collisions and subduction plate tectonics, then probably we have to pull the boundary for the beginning of plate tectonics as long as first subduction zone started. But if we call modern style plate tectonics something that we see now, then this specific style, I do think indeed started quite recently.
Okay, so we have another question. Well, we have many more questions. I don't, and I'm going to apologize now if we don't get to yours. So can you, maybe Kent touched on this. Can you discuss how an orthosite can be used as evidence for both for Condi and against you for subduction related tectonics?
No, I can't. What I see in the compilation of ash walls is that there's this remarkable concentration of these massif type anorthosites in the Mesoproterozoic. And if there's an updated compilation or an alternate interpretation of why they're so concentrated in the Mesoproterozoic, I would be interested in that, as I'm sure Taras would. And right now, this is the compilation that we've got to go with. And I think that's about all. I don't know, Taras, do you want to say anything more?
No, I fully agree with Ken that we have to take, you know, the most recent compilations, and we will do this. But to me, the important point is that this Mesoproterozoic was different. And, you know, how to exactly interpret this difference? Either it's because of you know, shallow slab break-off, subduction was suppressed to some extent, or lithosphere became rigid and plate tectonic did not start it, or was very slow, or whatsoever. Then we still need to understand, you know. But what is quite clear to me that plate tectonic style was strongly evolving, and you know, this short episode of plate tectonic activity before boring billion was not similar to present day modern plate tectonic activity, and there are some good reasons for that in the rheology of the lithosphere. For example, we used to think that simply decreasing mantle temperature would always produce more rigid and stronger lithosphere, but it's not necessarily exactly so, because there is also lithospheric depletion that is playing a very major role in rheology, and there is also grain size reduction, which is strongly dependent on depletion. So these things can counter-interact, and we can have, for example, sweet point for slab break-off, say exactly in the Mesoproterozoic. This is a thing to be, for example, explored from rheological point of view.
Well, Bob and Taras, the question was geared more petrologically, because it seemed like it was a petrological argument rather than the presence or absence of an orthosite.
Yeah, I agree that I did not really respond to your question. I was just trying to expose my point of view.
Well,
So is there a way to argue that an orthosite, the presence of an orthosite at all, is somehow indicative or counter to plate tectonics, or
well,
in this case to subduction zones?
Let's answer it this way: if it's characteristic of plate tectonics, why isn't it forming today? And I think the answer to that is it requires unusually dry conditions so that you get extreme iron enrichment, plagioclase floats, and you get these emassive type anorthosites. The reason it doesn't happen today is melts have higher oxygen fugacity, and that does not allow the extreme iron fractionation that you need to float plagioclase. Does that help?
It does. So then I'd ask Kent, how does he use it in the opposite sense?
Well, I pointed out in my talk that there are rafts of this type of anorthosite that are found in A-type granites. And I think you really have to take in the level of exhumation in the crust. There may be a lot of these massive anorthosites that are not exposed yet. And as erosion goes on in the younger belts, we know A-type granites now are very abundant in the Cretaceous or the Mesozoic in general in China and other places. They may not be typical of the Mesoproterozoic, and the association with the anorthosites may also not be typical. I think we cannot hang on to this, or what I would say a well-enstrained prejudice in the literature, as we gain more and more information about the distribution of A-type granites and of anorthosites. We have to be willing to look at the association as a whole and how we see it in younger rocks.
Thanks.
Let's look at Sally Person's question.
Yeah, I was about to say we should move along, and I see, David, that your hand is raised. There's a couple questions, and before your comment, how is the model consistent with preservation of alluvial diamonds in 3.0 GA conglomerates and quartzites in almost a dozen localities globally? Early cool strength lithosphere is evident in a number of data sets.
Yes, I don't think diamonds are plate tectonic indicators. I don't think there's any requirement that everywhere the lithosphere be weak, especially under continents. The argument about plate tectonics has to do with the strength of the oceanic lithosphere, not the continental lithosphere. The continental lithosphere seems to have a different evolution than the oceanic lithosphere, and diamond formation and preservation in alluvial sandstones doesn't seem to be a problem as far as I can see. What do you think, Taras?
So potentially you can form diamonds by, for example, dripping off sediments and some kind of greenstone belt materials during these vertical tectonics or these single lid tectonics. And you see lots of drips of wet materials with potentially containing also some carbon and so on. So I don't think really that diamonds are indicators for subduction. And once again, you know, I also do not want to prohibit any subduction at single lid, active single lid regime. It's just different types of subduction that you see with frequent slide break-off, very shallow may happen. And then most important is that you do not have confined rigid plate mosaic, which is moving more or less simultaneously. And instead, what you see is that plates are internally deformable, and then you can see uncorrelated spreading and subduction, and you can also see uncorrelated spreading and drips and delamination. So, and potentially probably elements of these tectonics we can even see during the modern plate tectonics.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm going to probably definitely disagree, because we absolutely have 150 to 200 kilometer thick lithosphere very early, as a direct contrast to the lithosphere diagram you presented. And I would suggest you look at Graham Pearson's work and his group on this, who does extensive work on the xenolith sweeps and kimberlites through time. But I'll let go, and maybe we can squeeze in Dave Evans' question. Thanks.
All right, Francis McDonald had a question.
You can pass me to Dave's question.
Okay, go ahead, Dave.
Hi, thank you, Francis, and thanks for, I'll lower my hand here. Thanks for taking me a little bit out of turn. I was typing my third of 3 comments in the chat, referring to, Bob, thank you for your talk. Thank you for allowing us to explore this unconventional space. I do have an opinion about that, especially with the paleomag data, which has been raised earlier. I'll just say that what was going to be my third point in the chat was that, yes, there are contentious issues in paleomag for the Precambrian. We have learned a lot in the last 10 years, especially about the Mesoproterozoic. We have found that through detailed investigations of the Earth's magnetic field behavior, that as far as we can tell, the field was axial, in that evaporite paleolatitudes correspond with paleomagnetic paleolatitudes. We have found that it was dipolar when we look at the inclination distribution across time of high quality data. We've found that the secular variation of the wobbles of the field is more or less similar to that of the last 5 million years through updated tests of data. We found that reversal frequency is similar in the Proterozoic as it is to the modern time. We found that the frequency, with the exception of the Ediacaran period, which is unusual. We found that supercrons are occurring at about the same rate as they are in the Phanerozoic time, another fascinating topic of discussion. But all of the tests that we have thrown at the Earth's magnetic field in the Mesoproterozoic have shown that, for all we can tell, the data are consistent with a field which is similar to the long-term field today. So you can, of course, you can come up with some other model arbitrarily to explain that, as Jim Sears has for his quadrupole field, but he's made things very, very complicated, and the simple solution, maybe not always the best, but in this case, it seems to work. We have also found that not just like little ultra slow spreading, we found comparable spreading rates when you look at an updated synthesis of latitudinal motions across the sphere through the last 2 billion years in a model that I've been developing with Bruce Eglinton, building on work that we did with Sally Pearson some years ago. And yeah, so we're not looking at like ultra slow motions. We're not looking at single lid static behavior. We're seeing differential motions on the order of centimeters per year. So that's the comment from Paleomag. Of course, we should question everything, but when we do ask those really, really get to the heart of the matter questions, we find that the evidence seems to support a uniformitarian model of kinematics on the surface of the Earth back through the Mesoproterozoic. That's my comment. And I'd love to hear your response.
Well, thank you for making those points. The paleomagnetic story is a key part of it. And it is only one part of it. So it doesn't trump any of the other evidence, and there is other evidence that would argue differently. And the evidence can be interpreted in a wide range of ways. I think we just need to consider all of the evidence, continue this discussion, think about what might have occurred. And I think thinking about emergent systems is useful for us going forward as a community in the 21st century.
I would agree with thinking about emergent systems. I would also just say that whatever model you produce for the Mesoproterozoic, of course, Mesoproterozoic is not the same as today. Whatever model you produce should probably have differentially moving mobile elements at rates of centimeters per year. And if you can incorporate that, that would make the paleomagnetists.
Yeah, and I think I sent you an email asking you for your latest paper on this that will guide Taras and I in further explorations.
Yeah, once again, I should just repeat that single lid is not stagnant lid. So I do think that probably continents were more rigid and as rigid as today, but in ocean something different was happening. So I would think, you know, more frequent slab break-off, rudimentary subduction, so no interconnected network of oceanic plates and so on. So, you know, until I see all these things in a global model which develop in the same manner as Earth, I cannot tell, you know, anything unless just some speculations.
Okay, Ken, I think it looks like you might be shifting in your seat to comment. Your hand's still raised. It looks like, Ken, if you would like to unmute yourself and say something, or we can move along.
Well, why don't we give some others a chance? I think Jean Bedard has been anxious to say something.
Okay, yeah. Francis, I know you would be considered next in line, but.
No, I've already spoken. We should hear from John, and Eric Sperling had a nice point about preservation as well.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I don't find the term single lid useful. I'm sorry to be an agnostic here, but if it's not moving, it's single lid. If it's moving, it's single lid. So it doesn't seem to make any sense, especially as someone said, if continents are moving in different directions, they're different blocks. It's not a single lid. So I just don't see it as useful. There's of course a distinction between a stagnant lid, a stable lid, etc. Could you comment on the different terminology? Because I think it's critical that we have a useful set of terms as opposed to things that are too broad to be of any practical use.
Okay, Taras, you'll jump in at any time, but I would like to simply point out that there's strong evidence the Mesoproterozoic was different in many ways from what we recognize as modern plate tectonics. It's also got to be recognized that the single lid tectonic magmatic style encompasses at least 3 different varieties just from looking around our solar system, and almost certainly includes others. It's got to be acknowledged that the existing terminology is confusing and poorly defined. And Taras, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, exactly. I would call the paper that Jean wrote with Lyle recently about, you know, these motions in the within the lithosphere of Venus. So is it plate tectonics? No, it's not plate tectonics. Is it single lid? Yeah, it's single lid. It's not stagnant lid, because you see motions of some elements. We see like more rigid elements. We see in single lid, which is not dissected by plate boundaries. So to me, single lid is in fact actually is an advance compared to previous contraposition of stagnant lid versus plate tectonic. So, and there is nothing in between. So I do think that single lid and varieties of single lid behavior, heat pipe, you know, this plume and drip type of behavior, and even with including some rigid elements, is moving us toward better terminology. So at this stage, I do feel that single lid term is good and better than stagnant lid. But
well,
we can invent something even better.
Yeah, I kind of prefer episodic mobile lid, because there's a plate tectonics is a kind of mobile lid system. So Venus, it goes through episodic mobile lids events that are different from plate tectonics, and in between it lapses back into stagnant lid mode. Now that is useful. And on Venus, if I think we've made a good argument that Ishtar Terra moved about 1,000 kilometers differentially to the rest of it. So how can that be a single lid? If parts of it move, well, it's a 2-component lid or a 3-component lid, not a single lid.
So it could be that what you are describing was exactly what was shaping out Mesoproterozoic. So it was a kind of episodic mobile lead, but was not definitely not modern style plate tectonic.
You mean like a supercontinent?
Well, weren't there two big blocks? I mean, Laurentia, or the part that turned into the Grenville, was moving differently from the rest in the Proterozoic. So it can't be a single fixed lid. It has to be stuff moving differentially.
Well, this is a question, I guess, is a supercontinent a single lid?
Well, it's a localized lid, but it's not, it doesn't cover the whole planet.
Paul Silver and Ben argued 10, 15 years ago that the easiest time to move to a single lid, or what they call stagnant lid, was when a supercontinent formed. You've destroyed important subduction zones, and that is the easiest time to get to that new tectonic regime. So yeah, the two are related. Supercontinents and single lid or single lid alike episodes are related.
Yeah. We have to be careful when we make sweeping statements about the oceanic crust older than 180 million years ago, because most of it isn't preserved. 75% of the Earth was covered with something that we have very few samples of. So I'd be very hesitant to make overly broad generalizations.
Yeah, what we can definitely use are, say, experimental data on rheology of oceanic lithosphere, because if we believe in, in changes in the mantle temperature, we can predict the degree of depletion of the upper mantle and the lithosphere, and then we can also predict more or less rheology. And what rheology, with incorporation of this grain size related damage suggested by Berkovici and Ricard repeatedly, what it shows with increase in the mantle temperature from now backward to Mesoproterozoic, you have strong degradation of the strength of the oceanic plates because of this slab segmentation and very frequent break-off. And it could be a sweet spot for lithospheric weakness. So it might be that, in fact, at this period of time, oceanic lithosphere was too weak instead of too strong to sustain subduction.
I agree.
All right, I think, Paul, you had plenty of comments in there and would be next to speak, I think.
I guess I had two questions. The first was, Earth is the only terrestrial planet that has both plate tectonics and life. And so my question was, do you think this is a coincidence? And my second question was, what is the observation which, if it was made, would falsify the single lid Mesoproterozoic hypothesis?
Well, to the first point, life began at least 3.8 billion years ago, which is a time when most people who've thought about it do not think Earth had plate tectonics. So if that opinion is correct, then yes, it was a coincidence. Now, advanced life, complex life that's capable of arguing over Zoom, that probably does require plate tectonics, but not simple self-replicating cells. So to the second point, what would be the single thing that would falsify it? Now that's a good question. I don't really know. Today, I mean, the continents were moving when Wegener was talking about them moving, and the community disagreed with him, even though the continents were actually moving at that time. So that's a good question. I wonder what, if that question was posed to him, what he would have said. I really don't know how to respond to that one, Paul. I'll keep it in mind, though. It's certainly an interesting.
Well, I mean, that's the definition of a scientific hypothesis.
Oh, sure.
It is the list of statements which would contradict the hypothesis if they were made. I mean, that's how Popper defined science.
Well, I think Popper would, if he understood what we were arguing about, also say that what we're doing is science, even though he might say, well, I can see why you might have trouble making a single falsifiable proposition. So,
well, he was a realist, so he just urged hypothesizers to think about the question I asked.
yeah, no, that's a good question.
So next question is, I think, sorry, Fabricio, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, Caxito. It says, great talk, thanks. 2 quick questions. Is there any geological evidence for plume-induced subduction initiation in the early Earth? Example, plume-related or influenced rock suites followed by calc-alkaline magmatism or other arc-related features?
That's a good question. I don't have one that comes to mind. Taras, do you?
As far as I recall, Van Kranendonk, he was arguing about, you know, some plume-induced subduction and plume-induced subduction-related processes for the early Earth. And he was one of the first to draw this analogy in between Venus and Archean Earth. But otherwise, so the most convincing evidence they were found for really relatively recent times. These are works by Bob and his co-authors. So there can be, for example, gradual transition in between plume-induced signatures to subduction signatures. Whether for Archean we have such undisrupted record that would locally allow to make such things, I don't know. But Lyle Harris, he was showing recently some evidence, geophysical evidence for plume-induced processes for Archean or Proterozoic for Precambrian history. And he's currently working on the paper where some kind of circular structures were created due to what he thinks was plume-induced activity. So this is as much as I can say.
Their second question was, after widespread subduction initiation in the Paleoproterozoic, extensive Wilson cycle origins culminating in the amalgamation of Columbia Nuna, how was it halted to reach a stagnant lid scenario globally?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer would be. Certainly when the supercontinent was formed, the intervening subduction zones were destroyed. And if those were the only subduction zones, then that would have made the transition to single lid easy. Beyond that, I don't know.
Yeah, we had a long discussion with Bob when preparing this talk. So I have some line of speculations where mantle depletion counter-interact with grain size induced damage. And then you can have like weak lithosphere because of hot temperatures, thick crust, and lots of sublithospheric melts. Then it will become stronger with decreasing mantle temperature, but still very high lithospheric depletion. And then it can become really weak when depletion will decrease and temperature is still moderately high, which will maximize oceanic lithosphere damage due to this brittle ductile damage and grain size reduction. So then it can be that in the Earth's history we have first weak, stronger, then very weak, and then stronger again corresponding to modern style plate tectonics. But this is pure speculation. So I cannot demonstrate that in a single model you can reproduce all these different transitions.
Okay, to interrupt this, I need to leave, but that doesn't necessarily mean the discussion has to stop. Andre, if you want to manage question session, that's fine. Messages continue to come in, so it looks like this could go all day. So what do you think, Andre?
I can take over. So let's see, where did you stop?
We left off with Catherine Bethany. Sorry.
So that's the next one.
That's the next one. You see it? It says that that's just a comment saying there is some good evidence in the Archean record of Western Australia for a possible transition like this at around 3.2.
Did you do Bruce Eglinton?
Was he above here?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been out of. I may have been out of. I may have missed some people, but Bruce hasn't gone yet.
Okay, so we start on
Gerya.
Bruce. Do you want to ask your question yourself, or would you rather me read it?
Hi, Andre, and thanks, Bob. It's, as you can see, the discussion, it might be polarized, but it certainly is stimulating. Mine was more a comment that some of the ore deposits seem to provide some evidence. VMS ones in